The autumn wind whistled through the empty streets of downtown, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the main boulevard. It was nearly midnight, and the city had settled into its familiar rhythm of shadows and streetlights. Most decent folks were home, tucked away behind locked doors and drawn curtains, leaving the night to those who thrived in darkness. Jason Martinez pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked alongside his three friends down the cracked sidewalk. At 17, he was the unofficial leader of their small group, though he'd never asked for the title. It had simply fallen to him through a combination of reckless confidence and a willingness to push boundaries that the others admired and feared in equal measure. "Man, this neighborhood gives me the creeps," muttered Danny, the youngest of the group at 15, his voice barely carrying over the wind. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows between the abandoned storefronts. "That's because you're a baby," laughed Marcus, shoving Danny playfully. Marcus was Jason's age, but where Jason was lean and quick, Marcus was built like a linebacker, all broad shoulders and thick arms. Nothing here but empty buildings and rats. The fourth member of their group, a quiet girl named Sarah with purple-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers, said nothing. She walked a few steps behind the others, her camera hanging around her neck like a talisman. Sarah documented everything they did, turning their late-night adventures into a kind of visual diary that lived on her social media accounts. They'd been wandering the streets for hours, driven by the restless energy that seemed to possess all teenagers on Friday nights. School was out, parents were asleep, and the world felt like it belonged to them alone. They'd already tagged a few walls with spray paint, explored an abandoned warehouse, and shared a stolen bottle of cheap wine that Marcus had lifted from his older brother's stash. But Jason was getting bored. He craved something bigger, something that would give him that rush of adrenaline that made him feel truly alive. The night was still young, and he wasn't ready to go home to his mother's disappointed sighs and his stepfather's lectures about responsibility. That's when they saw it. Parked in front of a crumbling brick building that had once housed a dry cleaner, a police cruiser sat alone under a flickering streetlight. The building itself had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up with plywood that was now covered in graffiti and concert posters. But the cruiser looked official, its black and white paint scheme gleaming under the orange glow of the street lamp. "Holy shit," whispered Marcus, stopping in his tracks. "Is that thing real?" Jason felt his pulse quicken as he approached the vehicle. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and he could see the glow of the dashboard lights through the windshield. This wasn't some decommissioned police car sold at auction. This was the real deal, and it was just sitting there, unguarded. "Looks real to me," Jason said, his voice steady despite the excitement building in his chest. He walked closer, his friends trailing behind him like nervous satellites. "Question is, what's it doing here?" "Maybe there's a cop inside," Danny suggested, his voice shaking slightly. But as they drew closer, it became clear that the cruiser was empty. The radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter, but there was no sign of its driver. It was as if the officer had simply vanished into thin air, leaving his vehicle behind like a ghost ship. Jason's mind raced with possibilities. This was it, the adventure he'd been looking for. The ultimate prank, the kind of story that would make them legends at school. He could already imagine the looks on their classmates' faces when they heard about it. I bet I could drive it around the block before anyone notices, he said, trying to sound casual, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Are you insane? Danny's voice cracked. That's a police car, man. You'll get arrested, or worse. Only if we get caught, Jason replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Come on, when are we ever going to get another chance like this? Sarah raised her camera, already framing the shot. This is either going to be epic or a complete disaster. Those are the best kind of stories, Marcus said, though Jason could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The four teenagers stood there for a moment, staring at the cruiser, as if it were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The wind picked up, sending a plastic bag skittering across the empty street, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm began to wail. Jason felt the weight of his friend's expectations pressing down on him. He'd built his reputation on being the one who would do what others wouldn't dare. If he backed down now, he'd never hear the end of it. More importantly, he'd never be able to look at himself in the mirror without feeling like a coward. Screw it, he said, reaching for the door handle. Life's too short to play it safe. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Jason slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of coffee and leather, with an underlying scent of something he couldn't quite identify. The seat was adjusted for someone taller than him, and he had to reach up to grab the steering wheel properly. His friends crowded around the open door, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror. Sarah started filming, her camera capturing every moment as Jason's fingers found the keys dangling from the ignition. This is really happening, Danny whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Jason turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a deep, powerful rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the abandoned building. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, displaying a bewildering array of gauges, switches, and readouts that looked more like the cockpit of a spaceship than the interior of a car. Holy shit, it actually works, Marcus breathed, leaning through the passenger window. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The power beneath his fingertips was intoxicating. Hundreds of horsepower at his command, along with all the authority that came with the police badge. For a moment, he felt like he could do anything, be anything. Get in, he told his friends, his voice thick with adrenaline. We're going for a ride. They piled into the cruiser with the ungainly enthusiasm of teenagers who had never been in a police car before. Sarah claimed the passenger seat, still filming everything, while Marcus and Danny squeezed into the back, separated from the front by a metal mesh partition. This is so weird, Danny said, running his hands along the smooth plastic seat. I feel like I'm under arrest or something. You might be soon, Sarah replied, but she was smiling as she said it. Jason put the car in drive and felt it lurch forward with surprising smoothness. The cruiser was heavier than his mother's Honda Civic, but it responded to his touch like a well-trained animal. He pulled away from the curb slowly, trying to look confident even though his palms were sweating. They drove through the empty streets at a sedate pace, afraid to draw attention to themselves. The radio continued its steady stream of police chatter, codes, and locations that meant nothing to them but added to the surreal atmosphere of their adventure. Jason found himself sitting up straighter, unconsciously mimicking the posture he'd seen cops use in movies. Turn on the sirens, Marcus suggested from the back seat. Are you crazy? That's a sure way to get caught, Jason replied, but his eyes were already scanning the dashboard for the controls. "Just for a second," Sarah encouraged, her camera trained on Jason's face. "Come on, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Jason's finger hovered over a red button that looked promising. The temptation was almost overwhelming. When would he ever get another chance to flip on police sirens and feel that rush of absolute power? But something held him back. Some instinct that warned him they were already pushing their luck. "Maybe later," he said, finally. "Let's just enjoy the ride for now." They cruised through the downtown area, past closed shops and empty parking lots, feeling like they owned the city. The streetlights blurred past the windows, and for a few minutes, Jason allowed himself to forget about the consequences of what they were doing. This was freedom, pure and simple, the kind of wild, reckless freedom that adults had forgotten how to feel. But then Sarah noticed something. "Hey, check this out," she said, reaching towards the glove compartment. "I wonder what cops keep in here." "Don't touch anything," Jason warned, but his curiosity was piqued. What secrets did police officers hide in their cars? What tools and weapons and official documents might be tucked away in the various compartments? Sarah's fingers found the release mechanism, and the glove compartment dropped open with a soft thud. Inside, nestled among registration papers and maintenance records, was a worn leather badge holder. It looked old, the leather cracked and faded from years of use, but it was unmistakably official. "Whoa," Marcus breathed, leaning forward to get a better look. "Is that real?" Jason felt his heart skip a beat. This was crossing a line, touching something that belonged to an actual police officer. But the badge seemed to call to him, its silver surface gleaming under the dome light. Before he could think better of it, he reached out and picked it up. The badge was heavier than he'd expected, solid and substantial in his hands. The metal was warm, as if it had recently been worn against someone's chest. Jason opened the leather holder and read the name engraved on the silver shield. Officer Michael Rodriguez. Badge number 2847. The name hit him like a physical blow. Rodriguez. He knew that name, had heard it somewhere before. The memory was foggy, buried beneath months of other news stories and forgotten headlines. But it was there, nagging at the edges of his consciousness. "Rodriguez," he said aloud, hoping one of his friends might remember. It was Danny who made the connection first. His face went pale, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Officer Rodriguez. Wasn't he the cop who got killed last year?" The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jason felt the badge grow heavier in his hands, and suddenly, the warm interior of the cruiser felt cold and oppressive. He remembered now. The news reports, the funeral procession, the grainy security footage played endlessly on local television. "That's right," Sarah said slowly, her camera forgotten in her lap. He was responding to a domestic disturbance call. Someone shot him when he got out of his car. "I remember now," Marcus added, his voice barely audible. "The shooter stole his cruiser afterward. They never found it." The implications of what they were doing crashed down on Jason like a collapsing building. This wasn't just any police car. It was the final resting place of a fallen officer, a man who had died in the line of duty. They weren't just joyriding in a stolen vehicle. They were desecrating a shrine. Jason's hands shook as he held the badge, and for the first time in his life, he understood the weight of true responsibility. Officer Rodriguez had been someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. He'd put on this badge every day, sworn to protect and serve, and he died trying to help people. "We need to get out of here," Danny said, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is wrong. This is so wrong." But Jason couldn't move. He stared at the badge, at the name etched into the silver, and tried to imagine the man who had carried it. What had his last thoughts been? Had he been afraid? Had he thought about his family? His friends? The life he was leaving behind? "Look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to the rear window. Jason turned to see what she was indicating and felt his stomach drop. There, in the corner of the back window, was a small, perfectly round hole. The glass around it was spider-webbed with cracks, and Jason realized with horror that he was looking at a bullet hole. "Oh, God," Marcus moaned, covering his face with his hands. "Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, God!" They began to notice other things then, details that had been invisible to them in their excitement, but now seemed to glow with significance. Dark stains on the passenger seat that could only be blood. Scratches on the dashboard that might have been made by desperate fingers. The lingering scent that Jason had noticed earlier, which he now realized was the smell of death. This wasn't just a police car. It was a crime scene, a memorial, a tomb on wheels. And they had violated it with their presence, turned it into a playground for their juvenile adventures. "We have to put it back," Jason said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We have to put it back exactly where we found it." None of them argued. They drove back to the abandoned building in complete silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The radio chatter that had seemed so exciting before now sounded like the voices of the dead calling out from beyond the grave. Jason parked the cruiser in the exact same spot where they'd found it, aligning it perfectly with the curb. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant sounds of the city. Carefully, reverently, he placed Officer Rodriguez's badge back in the glove compartment and closed it. The soft click of the latch sounded like a coffin being sealed. They got out of the car slowly, none of them speaking. Jason was the last to leave, taking one final look at the interior before closing the door. The streetlight cast long shadows across the windshield, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure in the driver's seat, watching him with sad, understanding eyes. They walked away without looking back, their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. The night that had started with such promise now felt heavy with regret and shame. They had set out to create a memory, and they had succeeded, but not in the way they'd intended. The weeks that followed were difficult for all of them. Jason found himself thinking about Officer Rodriguez constantly, researching his life online, learning about his family and his service record. He discovered that Rodriguez had been a decorated officer, beloved by his community, a man who had volunteered at youth centers and coached Little League baseball in his spare time. The guilt was overwhelming. Jason had always prided himself on being fearless, on never backing down from a challenge. But now he understood that true courage wasn't about taking risks or pushing boundaries. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when no one was watching. He knew what he had to do. The police memorial wall was located in the lobby of the downtown precinct, a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of officers who had died in the line of duty. Jason had visited it 3 times before working up the courage to actually go inside. Officer Rodriguez's photograph was near the bottom of the wall, a formal portrait that showed him in his dress uniform, his badge gleaming on his chest. He looked young, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and a slight smile that suggested he'd been trying not to laugh when the picture was taken. Jason stood before the memorial for a long time, holding a single white rose that he'd bought from a flower shop down the street. Other people came and went around him, police officers reporting for duty, civilians filing complaints, lawyers meeting with clients, but no one paid attention to the teenager with the flower. Finally, Jason found his voice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his words barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "We didn't know. But I do now." He placed the rose at the base of the memorial, below Officer Rodriguez's photograph. The flower looked small and insignificant against the vast expanse of granite, but Jason hoped it would be enough. A small gesture of respect, a token of remembrance for a man who had died trying to protect others. As he turned to leave, Jason felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around to find a middle-aged police officer standing behind him, her expression curious, but not unkind. "Did you know Officer Rodriguez?" she asked gently. Jason's throat felt tight, but he managed to answer. "Not personally, but I learned about him recently. I wanted to pay my respects." The officer nodded, understanding. Mike was a good man, one of the best, the kind of cop who actually cared about making a difference. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jason said, and meant it. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As Jason walked out of the precinct and into the bright afternoon sunlight, he felt something shift inside him. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there, but alongside it was something else, a sense of purpose, a determination to be better than he had been. He thought about Officer Rodriguez's badge, still sitting in that glove compartment, still waiting for its owner to return. Someday, Jason promised himself, someone would find that cruiser and return it to the police department. The badge would be given to Rodriguez's family where it belonged, and the car would be properly retired. Until then, Jason would carry the memory of that night with him, a reminder of the price of reckless choices and the weight of responsibility. He would never forget the man who had worn badge number 2, 847, who had died trying to protect strangers, who had left behind a legacy of service and sacrifice. The rose would wilt and fade, but the lesson would remain. Sometimes, the most powerful adventures were the ones that taught you about yourself, about right and wrong, about the difference between being fearless and being foolish. As Jason walked home through the busy streets, he made a silent vow. He would find a way to honor Officer Rodriguez's memory, to turn his shame into something positive. He would become the kind of person who protected rather than exploited, who served rather than took. It was the least he could do for the man whose badge had changed his life.